Hey guys, in this video I would like to show you my landscape master material, which has all the functions you need from RVT, parallax occlusion mapping, parallax occlusion with light vector, tiling, distance blend, several material layers, automatic slope function, and much more. So I just created a fresh new project and I just migrated my landscape material, and this is it. So you can just basically right click on this _landscape material, go to asset actions, and then migrate it to your own project. Let me just save this for now. After you clicked on migrate, you will see all the material functions behind that. So the only thing you need to do is just create a material instance, but we will do this just in a second. So what you can see here is just a basic landscape, 2 by 2 kilometers. I just quickly created this desert-like canyon type landscape in Gaia. So if I just right click on my landscape material, I can just create a material instance, and let me call this MI landscape. And then I can just click on the landscape which I created in Gaia and just click on this arrow inside this landscape material here on this landscape mesh. It's going to take a little bit of time, and what you're about to see here, this is pretty normal. So in order to have layer info, you just go on selection mode and you switch to landscape, or you can just press Shift 2. After that, you can go to paint, and then you can just click on this button called Create Layers from Assigned Materials. Once you did that, you will see that we are having 3 different materials ready. Besides 3 different materials, there's also an automatic slope function. So you can go crazy. So feel free to also have a 4th material, which will be your automatic slope rock material. But we will just now focus on desert type materials. So in order to reveal that, let's just quickly create 3 different types of materials. So for that, I will just go into the landscape and create a new folder called materials. Inside here, I will just drag in my first material, which will be desert sand. So what you need for each material in order to have all the functions available, I have a packed texture, which is called RDO. This is just an RGB channel. This just means that I have on the red channel the roughness, on the green channel I do have the displacement, and on the blue channel I have ambient occlusion. So we have 3 textures packed inside one texture. If you're not really sure how to do that, you can just go into Photoshop, or you can use GIMP, and you just copy and paste each texture in its own channel. So for red, again, it will be roughness. For the green channel, it will be displacement. And for the blue channel, it will be just ambient occlusion. Once you did all that, you're going to have a vibrant picture looking like that. Once you open that packed texture, you need to make sure that you disable the sRGB and save that. Also, for the displacement, you need to open that, and you need to change the default compression settings to grayscale, and you save that. Also, you need to make sure for the normal map, either if it's OpenGL, you need to flip the green channel. So usually for Quixel Megascans, they are in OpenGL, so you need to make sure that you flip the green channel. Otherwise, if you're not really sure if it's DirectX or OpenGL, just make sure that you have the information. So if it is DirectX, you don't need to change anything. If it is on OpenGL, the normal map, you have to flip the green channel. Also, you need to make sure that the compression settings for the normal map is set to normal map, but usually it is by default the normal map. So once you have that, you can go back to your content drawer here, and you open the MI landscape. And once you did that, you can just put it here next to our landscape paint layer, and you open the first layer. So the first layer would be your main material. Just activate the albedo, the normal, and the RDO. You should also activate everything else like tiling near, tiling far, the albedo tint, albedo controls, roughness, and the AO controls. In order to use the tiling near and far, and also the distance blend between a near texture and the far texture, which we will have for the background, you need to go to features and you use distance blend. So you need to make sure that you enable this. You can also use the Fresnel specular, so make sure that you enable this. And for the RVT, we will just leave it for now. Start fade distance and end fade distance you can set also. For the tiling near, I would just increase the tiling far to something like 5 as just for the start. And then I realize by default our albedo controls are completely pitch black. So this means that we need to make sure that our saturation is set to 1, our brightness is set to 1, and our contrast is set to 1. Everything else you can just open up. So next to the albedo controls, you can open up the tint, the specular and roughness, and also the AO controls. But for now, the default values should be fine, and then you can save. Now you can go to your first material. So just open up the material, which is the desert sand, and I will just click on the base color and click on this arrow in albedo. Then I just reopen my content drawer, I click on the normal, and click on the normal arrow. And finally, I go to the RDO, which is the RGB packed, so the red channel for roughness, the green channel for displacement, and the blue channel for ambient occlusion. So I click on that, and then I will just put it into my layer RDO and click on this arrow here as well. Now you can save again. Now let's just go back. In order to see our first material here, which is now visible, we need to create layer infos. So click on this plus here and click on the weight blended layer. Then he's going to ask you where to save the layer info. Just make sure that you go into the landscape and right click, create a new folder, and call this one layer infos. Inside this folder, just save the first layer info. Now you just need to repeat that for the second layer and also for the third layer. For the second layer and the third layer, we will just leave it for now. Now you can see that your main material here has been assigned, but it doesn't really look right. So let me put the tiling far to something like 8. Now you can see that right in front of us, the tiling far is visible. So we need to change that. You can go to the start fade distance and increase the start fade distance to something like 1000. And also the end fade distance, maybe you should put this to 1500. Now you can see that we have a texture here, which is our near texture. And far in the distance, we have the blend for our big texture. So what I can do here, increase this maybe to 2000. And the end fade distance maybe to 2500. So I will just keep the start fade distance, in this case for this map, on 500 and the end fade distance to 1500. So now you can see that our texture is getting bigger when we zoom out, and when we zoom in, our texture is getting more detailed. And you can even increase this effect if you want to, by just putting the tiling near to something like 1. And maybe even the tiling far to something a little lower, for example like 6. So now let's take care of our slope. You can see here that this is all black. This means that we don't have any rock material. When you go inside your master material here, you have a category for rock. So this rock is not paintable, as you have already seen in the landscape paint layers. But the rock is just an automatic slope function. So we can enable the rock albedo, normal, RDO, as well as the tiling near, far, the tint, albedo controls, specular roughness controls, and the ambient occlusion controls. Make sure that you always go again to the albedo controls and set this one to 1, 1, and 1, so it is visible. But now let's get in some rock texture. I go to the materials function, and then I will just go to my explorer here, landscape materials, and then I will just get a generic rock material. And I don't need the displacement in this case. Let me just drag this one in. Now again, I open up the RDO channel. I make sure that the sRGB is disabled. Then I save that. And then I check the normal map. I make sure that the compression settings is set to normal. And then I will also flip the green channel. And finally, I can go and put the RDO into the rock RDO, the normal into the normal RDO, and the albedo into the albedo. And now you can see that this generic rock material has been applied. So what we need to change here is not only the brightness and the color, but also the tiling is way too much. So I will just get the tiling far and set this, for example, to something like 10. Or maybe in this case 8 is fine. And then I can maybe go to the tint, just play a little bit the tint, a yellow color. But of course I can also here play with this saturation and put this saturation down just a little bit. Also the brightness should be reduced to make this more look like a rock. And the contrast, feel free to also play, maybe give it a little more contrast, or maybe if you want just a little less. It depends on your scene. In this case I really want to go for something like a canyon-like reddish tint rock texture. And then I will just decrease the tiling far to make it even less obvious that there is some tiling far in the distance. Now let me change the main material because it also doesn't really fit. So I can just reduce maybe just a little bit of the red. Just a tiny bit. I can play with the green value here to also introduce a little more of those yellow colors maybe. And then I can play with the saturation. Make this a little less saturated and reduce the brightness just a little bit. Also increasing the contrast just a little bit here. And now we can play with the specular intensity. So you can reduce the specular intensity to something like 0.1. You can also make sure when you go up that you have the Fresnel specular enabled. This means that we can play with the Fresnel amount here. But in this case I will just leave it at 1. And the overall specular intensity to something like 0.1. The normal intensity is also pretty important in this case. So you can make this a little sharper by increasing the contrast. Or make this maybe a little more soft to make it look a little more stylized if you want to. But in this case I will just slightly increase the normal intensity. So you can introduce the deep shadows if you want to by pushing up the black. So you can also play around with those black, middle and white values. So let me just go for the gray area, which is called the AO middle. And then I can just lighten up those gray areas here if I want to. Or in this case, maybe I just want to darken them. But this is completely up to you. I will just lighten them up a little bit. And also the highlights, so the AO white, you can just make them a little brighter or just maybe a little darker. But in this case, I will also just raise them a little bit. And finally, I will go back to the tiling far and set this maybe to something like 12 to get rid of this horrible tiling here. And I want to reveal a little more of the near tiling. So I need to go back to the start fade distance and put this to something like maybe 500. Or maybe even 750. And we can increase the end fade distance to something like 1200. And then I will just switch from tiling near 1 and set this to 2. And now this is looking much better. Feel free to also go back to the rock, switch the texture if you don't like it. Or play with those values to make it fit a little more. So in this case, I just increased the contrast a little bit and also introduced a little more red color on the albedo tint. But what is also pretty important, that you change the specular intensity and reduce this maybe to something like 0.2 and also the Fresnel amount, play with those values. So in this case, I will just raise it up to something like 5. I will leave the roughness intensity to 1 and the normal intensity, I will just play around with those values, maybe just to raise a little bit the normal intensity here to get a little more of this contrast and edginess and detail. I will try to push the AO black just in case if there is any information, but in this case there's not, so we can play around with the AO gray area and lighten them up just a little bit if you want to. I will just reduce this to something like 0.1 or 0.2. And the AO white, I will just also increase the value just to see what spots will be visible. I will just slightly increase them to something like 0.3. Then you have also a function for the slope, so you can also decide the slope amount and also the slope fall off. So we can maybe just reduce the slope amount to something like a value of 1. So I can also just reduce the slope amount here to something like 1.2. And also the slope fall off, you can play around with those values. Maybe you want to have a softer fall off, so feel free to also decrease the number or make it sharper. You can just go and increase this. But this is not all. We also have more functions here I can show you. We also have more functions here I can show you. So in this case, let me just get another material. What I can do now, once I save my material instance, I can go back to the landscape, and now we can see here, this is my second material. So let me just create also a layer info. So click on the plus here and create a weight blended layer. And the second layer info, we will also just put this into our landscape layer infos folder and save that as well. Now I can minimize my material instance, go to the paint layer here, click on the second layer, reduce maybe the brush size to something like 300 and paint now a little bit of that. And around those edges, you can also see that the blend is not a regular blend, but it's a height blend. So we are using the height information to blend our materials. I can see that this construction rubble is pretty flat and doesn't look realistic at all. So what I can do now in my material landscape, I can just open the material instance again, go to the second layer, and after I check the second layer, I can now open up the parallax occlusion mapping. So in this case, I want to use the parallax occlusion mapping. After that, you can already see that we do have some geometry here, but this is not everything. We can even enable the shadows, which I will show you in a sec. After that, we can even use, instead of the RDO channel, which is the displacement in the green channel, we can use the displacement as a separate texture. So once we enable this, we do have a displacement available now. I can now click on that, go back to my material, click on this construction soil, search for the displacement, and put the displacement into the displacement channel. So now I will have a much better and much more realistic displacement in my parallax occlusion mapping. The reason why that is because the displacement texture is set to linear grayscale. Now let me go to the parallax occlusion mapping controls. I can open that one up, and I can decrease the strength to something like 0.03, or maybe even crank this up to something like 0.08, just to get more of this effect. So let's just keep it at 0.04 for now. You can see that I enabled the shadows, but the shadows are not really correct. They look pretty weird. So let's now enable the POM shadow controls. But in order to really have those shadow controls looking realistic, we should increase the shadow steps to something like 64, just for demonstration purposes, to get softer and more accurate shadows. And also for the POM controls, I want to set this to something like 128, and the max steps also to something like really high, 128. In order to have good shadows for our parallax occlusion mapping, I can create now something called a light vector. So let me just create a blueprint here. So for that, let me create a new folder and call this one BP_light vector. Inside this folder, I can just create a blueprint class. In this case, just a simple actor blueprint, and call this also BP_light vector. Once I open that one up, I can now go to the construction script. And inside this construction script, I just drag the default scene root into here. I can now drag off of here and type in set parameter. I can now drag off of the construction script and type in set parameter value. So in this case, we need a vector parameter value. He's asking for a collection. In this case, I already created a so-called material parameter collection, which is called POM. So in this case, you don't need to create one. And inside the parameter value, you can click on light vector. Now the default scene root, we can just dragging off from our default scene root. We also need to add something in between. In this case, we need to get our world location. After you got that node, you can just get the return value and put this into the parameter value. It will convert from a vector to a linear color. And then you can just mark everything and press Q. And this is everything you need to do for the blueprint light vector. And then just compile and save. You can close this blueprint now. When I just minimize this material instance, and after doing that, I'm checking the POM controls. And now I go into my content drawer here, go into my light vector, and just put the light vector into my scene. So now what you can see is that we are using our blueprint for getting shadows regarding our parallax occlusion mapping. And those shadows are, as you can see now, they are correct. So let me just put this light vector here, so everything is covered, and the position really depends. So now I can put the light vector maybe here. At the same time, it is pretty important that I press Ctrl L and move the sun maybe to the same spot. So in this case, if I want to have the sun maybe here on the left side, I will also put the light vector in the same direction as the sun to make it realistic. And now I can just play with the height here to see until I have the right amount of shadow and the right direction. Now we can go to the POM shadow controls and maybe set the softness to something like 5 to make it a little sharper, or something like 0.5 to make it more soft and more spread, or even go higher to something like 10 to make it really sharp. But in this case, I will just put this to 6. And as for the shadow intensity, you should crank this up to something like 0.7. And then you can just, let's decrease the shadow softness to something like 2. And also let's play with the height amount and put this up to maybe to something like 0.05. Let's also go to the second layer and adjust the tint and also the albedo controls as well as the ambient occlusion controls. I want to increase this just a tiny bit so that those deep creases are not completely pitch black. You can also lift them just a tiny bit. And as for the AO white, in this case, maybe you just want to decrease them just a tiny bit. But it really depends on the material you have. So I just might go for like some deep shadows and using this height, and also go back to the POM and put the shadow softness back to something like 0.8. Now you can see how natural that looks using the parallax occlusion together with the light vector. You should invest a lot of time changing and switching the albedo controls, the specular roughness, and also the AO controls. Now you can see here for the sand that we didn't use the displacement map. So we also should use the displacement texture for our sand. So let's just scroll up and we see here the displacement for our sand. So let's just enable this and we click on the sand displacement, and then we can click on this arrow here for the displacement in our layer 1. And now you also have some parallax occlusion for the sand. I will keep the shadow softness to something like 5 and the shadow intensity to something brighter, 0.5, so it fits with the sand, otherwise the sand is going to look a little too weird. But you have all the freedom to adjust your scene. Now let's get a little more height amount of the POM, so something like 0.5 is good. Also, since this is like a desert landscape, why don't we just go and add another material? In this case, I want to add maybe a road. One thing I forgot to tell you is that for each separate displacement texture, you also need to disable the sRGB channel here inside this texture. So just make sure that you do that as well for each separate displacement texture. And now you can see that our displacement is now even more accurate. And we go now to the third layer here. And let's also add a new weight blended layer. And we save this layer info in our landscape layer infos and save that. Just give it a couple of seconds to compile. And now let's try to paint maybe a small road. So let me set the brush size to something like 200. Or maybe even 150. So we go back and we open up our material instance and get the displacement and put it inside the displacement channel. Let's adjust the tiling far to something like 8 and the tiling near to maybe something like 1. If the displacement texture of the road is bothering you and is looking so weird, you can just open up the displacement of the asphalt in this case and just increase the brightness value to something like 3 or maybe even more to something like 4 to get rid of this noise and just save that. You can do the same for the sand displacement. If those spots are bothering you too much, then you can just weaken the displacement by just increasing the brightness, so it's not getting lowered so much. And then we can maybe just reintroduce the shadows and go back to the PM controls, and let's set now the shadow intensity to something like 0.7. And then we can paint even more and maybe blend in the sand in between here with a small brush. And then just maybe paint in some sand here. And now you can see playing around with all the values available for the landscape and painting with 3 different layers using the parallax occlusion, the tiling and everything. You can see what you can do with this master material, applying this onto your landscape. So if you like this material, this will be available on my Udemy course and my so-called environment masterclass, the Black Spruce Forest. We will go into detail on how to create every single thing, all the material functions, and it will be available for download. So thanks for watching.